Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our fall diverse discourse with our guest lecturer, Amanda Cachia, independent curator, artist critic based in San Diego. My name is Ashley DeHoyas. I'm the curator for DiverseWorks here in Houston, Texas. I am a third generation Mexican-American woman with curly brown and black hair, currently wearing a black sweater, sitting in front of a botanical pattern wallpaper. I am so excited to be able to host Amanda Cachia tonight for her guest lecture as a diverse discourse. I met Amanda in 2016 when I attended Maryland Institute College of the Arts in Baltimore, Maryland, where Amanda joined the MFA in Curatorial Practice program for their 25th, for the American Disabilities Act 25th anniversary curatorial workshop series. I have since been able to follow Amanda's work and quite frequently refer back to her website, The Flesh of the Worlds, as well as her writings that are listed on her website when I teach at University of Houston and other places. I'm super excited to invite Amanda to speak tonight on what will be a very honest and rewarding conversation about accessibility in the arts. Tonight, Amanda is going to present a panel, Curating Access, Disability Art, Activism, and Creating Creative Accommodations. Before we begin, I do want to point out a few housekeeping information or delineations. If you need access to transcripts, the live transcripts is available in our Zoom webinar. At the bottom of the screen, there are several options when you click the live transcript to make the text large or small, or you can have a full transcript off to the side of the screen where the chat usually appears. We do ask that you use the chat throughout the lecture to interact with us as we're going through the webinar. This is a webinar, so we can't see all of the participants. We can only see the attendees in the attendee side. So if you have any questions or if you are interested in asking a question, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to briefly just acknowledge that we are located on the ancestral lands of the Atacapa Ishak, as well as the Karankawa people, and recognize the native peoples that share the Southeast Texas region, including the Como Cruz, the Tonkawa, and the Kolinteka. We acknowledge this land as occupied, unceded territory and pay tribute to them. If you're calling in from or zooming in from another location, please feel free to use the chat to acknowledge the land that you reside on. Now, I'm going to pass it over to Amanda, who will begin her lecture. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to my talk today. My name is Amanda Cachia. Thank you so much to DiverseWorks for hosting me. It's a real honor to be sharing my work with all of you. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am a white woman. Currently, I'm wearing a black t-shirt and I have black rimmed glasses and brown curly hair that's currently sitting on top of my head. I'm sitting in my office and I have a painting on the wall behind me, colorful painting. And I also have, there are drapes at the window behind me, and there's lines, a pattern of lines on the drapes as well. I want to acknowledge the land that I am as belonging to the Liseño people. I'm based in Southern California, so I'm currently a couple of hours behind or ahead, however you want to look at it, I guess behind all of you in Houston today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as I'm doing that, it would just be really great to know if anyone has any access, particular access requests, particularly in relation to if you would like an image description. So I'll just give everyone a couple minutes to let me know if you do in fact need that. Are there any requests for image description? Okay, well, I am going to get started, and if there are any requests for that, it would be great to hear from somebody about that. Okay, so I'm going to give my talk today in about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time to ask questions at the end. However, I will encourage all of you to put questions in the chat as I'm talking too. It'd be really nice to hear from you along the way. So the talk that I'm going to give you today is kind of starts with the current moment, where we're based in the pandemic, obviously, and thinking about how access and disabled community have been affected by the pandemic. And people have been asking me so many questions about what does access mean in this current moment, because that's my area of specialization as a curator and as an art historian. I just start with this drawing here as a reflection of the moment that we find ourselves in. This is Dan Pajovsky, who is an amazing Romanian illustrator and artist. And it's called I Can't Breathe. And it's kind of, from last year, obviously making reference to George Floyd and civil unrest related to that, but then also the pandemic. So we see like a coronavirus droplet right here is like really making all of us feel really suffocated by this current moment, whether we have COVID or not, obviously. So, people have been asking me like, well, how has access improved thanks to the pandemic? We've all had to move on to an online environment. And I will say that I think that it's been mostly a positive thing for disabled folks, because no longer are we having to, go be in a space physically, but we can access all kinds of events and information online, which has come at a great relief for a lot of my friends and peers in the disabled community. And so now there's a little bit of concern of what happens when we go back to so-called normality. Will those kinds of modes of access decline? So I guess we have to wait and see what happens. But for the most part, even today's talk, for instance, we're able to share knowledge and share ideas online, and it can literally be with anyone around the world. So it's a really exciting moment, I think. But there's still things that need to be done to improve access for disabled people so that there's more leadership in museums. So more curators, more disabled curators, disabled directors, other kinds of staff that hold positions of power in order for us to be able to change how we perceive disabled people. The other bullet points here just talk about more events with disabled people, hanging more artwork by disabled people, collecting artwork by disabled, artists, and incorporating disabled art history textbooks in the bookshop and so on. So there's a lot more that can be done. And then, I will say that the exact same thing relates to other minorities. So this one here is saying we need to do the exact same, things for our friends, our allies in the other communities. So here's talking about Black Lives Matter, but I think it's an essential, criteria for any minority group, regardless of, whether it's a woman, like woman, gender, religion, ethnicity, race, sexuality, etc. And then this is just one of my favorite images to share, just starting off, is that creative access, which is, I'm a big proponent of creative access, and that's the topic of my talk today, is that, in fact, the deaf community, for instance, have already protested at how the masks that we've all had to wear have been inaccessible for them. And so this mother and daughter team created transparent masks so that the facial, the mouth and the face could be seen, because it's an essential part of communication in the deaf community. And this here is an Indigenous interpretation of the mask. You see the medicine wheel has been beaded onto this mask by the artist Ruth Carthand, who's a Canadian. And the medicine wheel, the colors convey notions of healing. And so she was really trying to bring some kind of, I guess, some healing properties towards the mask at a time last year when everyone was really afraid and not sure what was going on. And this is an artist who has been doing an amazing project online called My Dearest Friends. And she's been collecting letters from disabled people all over the world who've been expressing their fears and their concerns around how the pandemic has been affecting them. And so going back to this idea of like, well, how is the pandemic affecting the museum world, and what does access mean now? So the image on the left is a bench by New York-based artist Shannon Finnegan called Museum Benches. And the text on it reads, "This exhibition has asked me to stand for too long. Sit if you agree." And I love that, because Shannon is basically saying that, there's not enough spaces in the museum for sitting down. There are no benches. Why can't we have more rest stops and so on? So she makes really important commentary on how exhibition design and how lacking it is in terms of taking care of our bodies. And then, interestingly, all these benches in public spaces, such as parks, for instance, benches that we actually have had access to previously now suddenly did become ruptured or disrupted because we had to put caution tape over them. We weren't allowed to sit on them anymore owing to the pandemic and social distancing requirements. So it's kind of like, here we are trying to make progress on the one hand with the physical space of the museum, but then on the other hand, it's kind of been really disrupted. And now museums, whilst many of them have reopened their doors again, they're still, asking for less visitors through those spaces, which I guess some of us think can be a positive thing as well, in that our viewership experience maybe is more enhanced because there are less people. So just kind of turning more to my work now specifically, I've always been interested in being an activist around disability art. And that's because growing up, when I was, a teenager and starting to think about university and studies in my, undergraduate degree, I always went to museums and thought, where are the representations of the disabled body in the museum? And I didn't see any ever. Or if I did, they were like very limited and very narrow in their interpretation and in their representation. So I wanted to go to school to dedicate my thinking and my writing to disability art and my curating consequently. So for the last 10 years solid now, all I've been doing is thinking about disability in art, and that's what my work as a curator and an art historian. And I also see it as, like, just by the nature of it being a taboo topic, disability, the D word, I am an activist for that reason. And so I'm encouraging, my whole kind of thesis is to encourage curators in art museums to think about as part of your intellectual work and your curatorial work. Access is not a sort of tack on activity. It's not something that you do on the side, something that you should integrate into your overall practice, and that there are really fun and interesting ways of being able to do that. These are just some images. The images that are on the screen now are just showing you some of the, I guess, the different publications that have been interested in my work, some of my own writing. This here was published in Art in America last year. This was a piece about how to make exhibitions and art events accessible. And the image that you're looking at is me at the opening of one of my shows that I had curated about dwarfism and representations of dwarfism from the perspective of those who have dwarfism, as opposed to, like, I think, the very limited way that dwarfs have been looked at in art history, and in terms of like the sensationalism around their bodies and so on. This is an article that I had written for a book a few years ago, and it's simply just talking about, the guidelines that I'm offering to curate an exhibition that is accessible and that's creative at the same time. And this is another piece that I had written a number of years back now, 2013, also talking about how to, like, literally disable the museum and become an activist in a space that really, has not typically thought about their disabled audiences. So when we think about accessible exhibition design, actually the Smithsonian Museum has a pretty comprehensive guidelines, list of items that you can tick off on your, on your list, and the things that we always consider to be the fundamental access points, such as wheelchair ramps, for instance, or braille signage or large print, so audio description or image description. And then tactile tours are a really important part of some of the larger museums and their offerings to their disabled audience. And there are other guidelines out there in the world apart from what the Smithsonian offers. So Carolyn Lazard is a Black disabled artist that has developed this comprehensive PDF for how to make your exhibitions accessible. Shape Arts, which is a nonprofit gallery in the UK that are dedicated to disability art, they also have some guidelines on how to put on an accessible exhibition. So there's a lot of good resources out there for people. But for me, I really wanted, again, to interrogate these exhibitions more as like thinking about how to make access more a conceptual tool, and how to involve not just the curators who are putting together the exhibitions, but also the artists that are you're curating into your exhibition. How can they be part of the process of access? So the question is, how can we think of access creatively, or how can we be more creative about access? And then all the components that we are already familiar with, I'm trying to suggest that we can, think about them at a more intellectual level, and let's do something fun and creative with them. This is just a sampling of all the exhibitions, some of the exhibitions I've curated in the last 10 years. And I encourage folks to actually go onto my website, which is just myname.com, to learn more about all of my shows. And on my website, you'll also see all my writings as well. I think Ashley had mentioned that. So here's some of the things. Now what follows in my presentation is just some examples of the different kinds of ways that I've attempted to, curate access or be creative with access in collaboration with my artists. And I just want to emphasize that I've always thought of the process as like experimentation. I don't think that there's any one size shoe fits all. Like, I think that, it's just varies from exhibition to exhibition, and it varies from artist to artist. There is a lot of sensitivity around, with artists and disability, especially regarding language too. So I've made mistakes. I know Ashley said I would be honest in this presentation. So I will show you some mistakes that have been made, and areas for improvement, and that it's an ongoing process. So the images that we're looking at here is an installation by Carmen Papalia, who calls himself a non-visual learner. And he installed like these series of speakers along a hallway, and he actually hung them at different heights along the wall, so that people of different heights could actually access it. And you can see by the image on the left that this little girl here is able to actually press her ear right up against that speaker, owing to the variations in height, which is great. And hanging work on the wall at a different height is nothing new. The dwarfism show that I curated, all the work was hung purposefully lower on the wall so that the dwarf community could access it, but also it kind of benefits people in wheelchairs too, obviously, and children. So having these adjustments to the height of a work on a wall, I know that this was considered an exhibition designed by artists 30, 40, 50 years ago. But for some reason, it's never really become a permanent fixture in museums. And I think it would be great if we thought more creatively about that. And here's another image from the opening reception where we hung that work lower on the wall. I do know that, there was an artist, and I forget his name now, but he had invented actually like a pulley system where you could like make, you yourself as the viewer could adjust the height of that work with the pulley. That suits your own needs. So hanging, this idea of hanging an artwork at eye level is a bit of a fallacy, because it's like, well, whose eye level? Who do we assume is going to be able to access that? And then there's a lot of artists that I've worked with over the years that really try and antagonize their audience. And I've always enjoyed that because, the disabled folks feel like that the built environment is an environment that wasn't made for them. And every day they have to negotiate that environment, come up with, sometimes creative solutions in order to navigate that space. So, this video installation that you see here on this flat screen TV. This is an artwork performance by Naomi Lackmeyer, and she actually had gotten out of her wheelchair and dragged her body through the streets of London, and it was a video of this performance. And so we thought it would be good and interesting to actually stage the video documentation so that it was also on the floor, kind of, mirroring the image that you see on the screen. But also it's just kind of harder to see it, right? Like, so if you're an average height person, you kind of have to crouch down to see what's going on. And we did that to be purposefully antagonistic, again, towards the audience, the average height audience. Every show that I've curated in terms of thinking about documentation, I've always lately, I guess it's been at least 5 years now, maybe longer, I've always asked the museum that I'm working with to give me a website instead of a catalog. And I just think that websites are more accessible in general because they have a longer life. They're free, apart from paying for the Wi-Fi service, obviously, but they're also able to be screen reader friendly. And so what I've done is I've been able to work, fortunately, with the same website designer over the years, and she identifies as disabled as well. And she's very familiar with screen reader specifications. And so as you can see here, you're able to actually make adjustments to the color, contrast, the size of the text, and you can really make adjustments according to, what suits your vision best and your vision needs. So I've been really happy to be able to do that several times, as I said. So we did it for this exhibition here as well. And in this top right corner here, where it says show preferences. This is where you can click on that button, and then you can adjust that text size, style, line spacing, etc. The other really important part of my experimentation has been an image description or audio description. And so back in 2012, it's the first time that I was really able to, work with. I've been really lucky that I've been able to curate a lot of my shows in university galleries on campus. And so here we worked with a group of students to develop image description of all the objects in my exhibition. And, all of the students were able to, because there were so many students and not as many objects, the students would there would be multiple image descriptions for one object from different students. And we actually really enjoyed that because, as my friend Carmen always says, it's so important for blind folks to be able to have multiple descriptions available to them, kind of like, that you have so many choices on Netflix of what to watch. You kind of want multiple perspectives on the same object too. It just makes it more interesting. And here we, this image too, I should explain it, but basically all of the image descriptions were available to folks using different kinds of devices that were made available at the front desk. But in this case, we actually also made the descriptions available on the website. So there was a permanent record of those descriptions for the public. This is an image here that I do this as an exercise with my students actually in my art history classes, because I advocate for image description as being an important tool for formal analysis of artworks and helping students, describe images. And we go around the room and talk about how each person has something very different to say about the same image, even if there's 30 people providing those descriptions. And then the other nice thing is that my artists have been helping me and contributing to the image descriptions. So I've asked them and invited them to create the descriptions for their own artworks in an exhibition, and to also give me a written text or a written script of those descriptions so that we also have that available in multiple formats. And so my artists, for the most part, have told me how enlightening and enjoyable they've found that experience to be. And sometimes are very nervous. They're not really sure what they're supposed to do. It is a bit of a learning curve. But I also tell them to treat it as, an exercise in a writing exercise, like it can be poetry, for instance. It can be something where they let their imagination run wild. It doesn't have to just be strictly, purely what is so-called objectively in front of you. So I ask them to try and get away from that experience. And so here's some more examples of the scripts. This is a script that somebody had created of their artwork. And I also want to kind of emphasize that sometimes doing image descriptions are really laborious for some artists, depending on the nature of the artwork that they give me in my exhibitions. And so I've also realized over the years that I need to pay my artists. I need to compensate them for taking the time to make these descriptions. So that's something that I've also introduced into my practice recently. Here's just another example of text to speech or speech to text. You can do it both ways, but that all my exhibitions, like if there's any kind of written text, I also make sure that there's audio versions of them. And for folks who want to do their own descriptions at home, I mean, there's so many different, these days you could do the recordings in so many different formats, and Vocaroo is one of them. You can do a recording and it turns into an MP3 file. This is my show that I did back in 2016, and I had Braille labels, and I also had labels that basically told people about how they should participate with the work. And so I really wanted folks to be able to interact in some way with every single artwork in my show, and they were able to touch everything for the most part. So we kind of gave them instructions on how to do that. And then this is the case of, this was a sound piece. So Wendy Jacob, the artist, actually described the sounds, which I really enjoy. So it's not just describing the visual aspects, but now you're describing the sound. And in this case, this is a work by two artists, and their piece is actually a scent-based piece, the scent of grass. And so he actually provided me with a description of the smell of grass. And I had never thought of that before, because he said to me, oh, well, Amanda, why do we assume that everyone has the same ability of smell? So he said, let's talk about that in the description as well. And he really enjoyed writing about that. So it was a true poetic exercise for him too. When I did this, another show, there was a show that I curated called Loud Silence, and it was kind of trying to debunk the theory that deaf people don't have any access to sound or don't understand the concept of sound and so on. And so I was inspired by the Whitney Museum, who had actually put together a vlog where they had Christine Sun Kim, an deaf artist, who provided ASL tours of every single show at the Whitney. And it was online because it's like, well, what if you can't be there? It kind of seems like it was such a progressive idea at the time, I guess, but today it's like, it kind of seems like it should be standard, especially during this era of the pandemic, because these tours were only, say, available once a month. And so it was really kind of restrictive in a way, because you had to be present physically to go and see this tour in ASL once a month. And now they recorded this tour, so it was available all the time, and they got a lot of traffic through this show. And so I did one too. So I recorded, we didn't have many resources, and so we just recorded it on my cell phone, and I hired an ASL interpreter to come around with me and look and talk to an exhibition about an exhibition that this exhibition that I had organized, and we made it available to people at the front desk as well. And then my show toured, and we had more resources at this. This was at UCSD, and we were able to do a proper recording in a television studio. This is an opening reception for Sweet Gongs Vibrating, and these images are really just meant to showcase how everyone is touching the work. This is a piece where you could use a mallet and actually hit the gongs that were being suspended from the ceiling, and they would make beautiful sounds and beautiful notes. And here's another detailed shot of that, people interacting with that piece right there. So, this is the show where, I was being really idealistic. I wanted everyone to be able to touch the work. But it went well in the beginning. This is a piece where you could feel the vibrations of a cat purring if you touch the wall, which is really like a very sweet work. Here, people could play music, and you could hear different sounds. This piece here on the bottom right was actually very delicate work, made from bone china, but it was so smooth and cool to the touch. It was really lovely to be able to engage with that kind of work. You normally wouldn't be able to do that in a museum. This is a piece where if you had some kind of a sharp object in your pocket, like the end, like sharp keys or something like that, you could actually scratch the vinyl on all of these records. And then the artist Christoph actually did I think I have an image. Yeah, he did a DJ set with all of the scratched vinyl at the end of the show. So it was very interesting to hear the sound from people scratching. This is another intervention where I, talked with all my artists about, well, if you have a video-based work, which is visual and sound-based too in some instances, how are you going to make that available in a different format? And so they came up with this idea of giving me like a physical residue from the images that you see in the screen. And so this was a performance piece that was recorded, and Raphael gave me some of the pieces that she had used in the performance. So it became this more visceral experience for people, because you could hear and you could see, but then you could also touch. And there was the touching of the paper was like really like you could hear the crinkle, and it became a really enjoyable experience for people. And then the next image is like the same kind of intervention where I had a conversation with Darren, and he actually 3D printed these objects that you see that were floating in this kind of abstract composition in this video installation. So he printed them and he made them available on these ledges on the side of the wall, and people could just come up and pick it up and touch them. So it was a different level of engagement. Okay, and so I also worked with the blind community of San Diego. They developed a work based on different tactile environments in the city of San Diego. And then they came up with this group work right here. And then what we did was encouraged visitors to come in and actually add to the work, which again is like a highly unusual proposition. But guess what happened? This is like one of my experiments that didn't go so well. Unfortunately, there was damage sustained to much of the work, and the gallery director was not so happy with the outcome. So we had to shut down the touching aspect of the show. So they put "please do not touch" signs everywhere. So I was really disappointed with that. And I had to spend a lot of time thinking about what had gone wrong and what to do better next time. I mean, even as far as this one here, you can see the sign. It says "do not swing from the gongs." So we had a teenager had come by and thought that he was in the playground, I guess, and he started literally swinging off the gongs, and one fell and snapped in half. So it was such a shame that we still, again, in this case, we encouraged people to interact, but in this case, giving them specific instructions for how to touch, which I think is fine, and thinking about what that means in the museum and how to integrate and enforce that kind of behavior. So here's another one: "please handle all objects carefully," etc. Yeah, all of these signs I just took photographs of everything because I thought we really need to document this and think about how to improve this for next time. Is there an ethics of touching? Is there? I ended up sitting in the gallery actually 3 days a week for the run of the rest of the show, so I could interact with visitors and talk to them about how to touch an artwork. Because I think if you're not used to touching in a museum, which we are not used to, then once you're given that permission, people can go all kinds of directions and, maybe do things that are harmful to the work. This is an instance where we had an installation, you can see it on the top right here, of a scaffold and dancers who were kind of engaging with the work. But the artist did not want anyone to touch it. So what the gallery education team decided to do was just have, when they brought their school groups through, they had them recreate the scaffold with these black straws, which I thought was kind of a neat way of coming up with a way of like trying to visually, but also in a tactile way, think about the structure that it was in front of them in the space. And here they did, tactile games and drawings and so on. And same with this one here. Okay. So, the next big category, and there's so much good work out there now too, especially by Park MacArthur, but the idea is working with curators can also work with artists who are actually using access as their primary concept. So many artists are doing that these days. Christine Sun Kim, Kama Papalia, Park MacArthur, Carolyn Lazard, and many others like Shannon Finnegan, I already mentioned. So, they're actually saying, let's have our actual routine of access be the material for the work of art. And in this case, you're looking at a screenshot of Park's access routine, her care routine. She's a wheelchair user, and she has a collective of carers who come to her house to help move her body in and out of her wheelchair into her bed or into the shower, into the toilet, etc. And she basically recorded that routine and made it into an artwork because she wanted to give some more attention to care itself and how our bodies are all interdependent on one another. And this one is where she actually gave tribute in a label. She turned the label itself into an artwork and paid tribute to all the bodies, the people that have ever carried and held her in her lifetime as a wheelchair user. So I really enjoyed what she was doing with that too. And you can see all the different emojis that she's inserted into that tribute. Alison O'Daniel is also another disabled artist, and she is a filmmaker, and she creates her films where she's kind of changing the degrees of the sound that you hear. And she's also becoming, somewhat antagonistic again towards her audience, because here we have an ASL interpreter who's actually interpreting the score of the film, but there is no captioning at all, or there's no English captioning for what the interpreter is saying. And Alison does that on purpose because she feels that, as somebody who has a hearing impairment, that if she doesn't have access to sound and to translation services all the time, she wants to put the shoe on the other foot and see what it feels like to not always have access to that translation. And Alison has also built a career around, doing all these idiosyncratic scores, scores that don't necessarily rely on sound, but other kinds of symbols. And this is also a piece that an artist based in Canada, her name is Diane Borsato, has done, where she invited an ASL interpreter to come into the Royal Ontario Museum, into the Gems and Minerals exhibit, and they were giving a tour of the museum and in ASL, and then they kind of broke out into this like interpretive, spontaneous dance movement, thinking about how translation is potentially blended in with some kind of choreography of ASL. It also reminds me of Andrea Fraser's work in Museum Highlights, where she's kind of talking about like who is the person that has all the knowledge in the museum? Can we question the authority of the museum in terms of its knowledge and in terms of the information that is being fed to us through the exhibits? I know that I'm running out of time, so I also want to just make sure that we have time for questions and answers. So I'm going to actually stop my share and open it up to all of you to see if there are any questions.
So it doesn't look like we have questions yet, but while we're waiting for people to put their questions in the chat or the Q&A form, I did have a couple of questions for you. One being, and you kind of sort of addressed this in the beginning of your presentation, but in terms of access, it feels like most of the time people are afraid to start because they're afraid of also messing up. And so sometimes access is brought in too late to the conversation. And I'm wondering, you know, with the examples that you've given, it does look like there are certain spaces or organizations that are doing access really well. What type of, I guess, you know, in terms of like, where do you start? Like if somebody is wanting to engage in access that may be afraid to initiate it.
That's a good question. I think you have to, it depends on the resources that you have in the museum that you're working for. And, you know, it also depends on the artists that you're working with. I mean, I've certainly, you know, tried to engage with all my artists at all times, just trying to be activist in that sense. And sometimes it didn't go very well, like people don't want to engage. So I think the important thing is just having conversations first, just to see where other people are at. And if everyone's on the same page as you, that's where I would begin. And also what I've learned to do too over the years is to have conversations with the folks that I'm collaborating with and say, these are the important access components, and put that front and center and tell them, here's what this is going to cost, and build that into your budget from the beginning. Especially if organizations need to apply for grants, which they often do. So how to actually integrate that into the grants, how to integrate that into your contracts. So curator contracts or artist contracts, and how much to pay everybody. That's something that I've learned to do over time. It's just trying to think of that, putting that first rather than thinking about it afterwards. So that's been like a good way to start, I would say. But looking at, I was going to say that part of my presentation too has been kind of just commending younger generation disabled artists who are really good about doing image descriptions on their own on social media platforms like Instagram. Like it's been amazing to me just seeing, is it okay if I share my screen again just for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Like here, this is from the Loot Collective, and they're an organization that, well, they're not really an organization, it's just simply a website, a collective of disabled artists. And every month there's a special feature on a new disabled artist. And they feature somebody new who is talking about their artwork and how disability is affecting them and their identity. And here you can see that they're actually giving, see how it says ID, that's image description. And so they're giving a really good description of the person. And you know, I don't know, I just find it really exciting that they're doing this, you know, freely without any kind of institutional support. And so I'm also trying to say, actually, you can get a profile on a platform without having to be showing in a museum space, which is also really important to think about in terms of, you know, access for disabled folks, obviously, that it doesn't just have to be contained to a physical museum. Here's another example of, this is a disabled artist who's taking a selfie. She has quite a profile too online, and this is Emily Barker, and they're doing another image description of her, which I think is really, really good. So if you want to sort of get examples of, well, who's doing this and where is it, you just go online and search for Loot Collective or disabled artists. And this article here actually talks about how, it's an article that was in Bustle back in 2017, which is like so old now, I guess, but it says that artists are using Instagram to show what chronic illness, trauma, and disability looks like. So just by doing an online search as well, you can already find out what is out there.
I love that. There's a group that I follow that's called Creating New Futures, and I've noticed the last 2 times that they've sent out newsletters that they also have an audio description. It's like, you can read our MailChimp, but if you need an audio version of it, then click here and there's a link, and someone's actually just like reading the what's going on in their newsletter, which I think is a really interesting format that I haven't seen before. And I know at the beginning, we also shared kind of an image description based on our identity when we were
Mhm.
introducing. And that's something that I feel like is newer because of Zoom
Mhm.
and whatnot.
Yep, definitely. I mean, even, you know, the Zoom thing is like having the closed captioning hasn't been there all along on Zoom, and my deaf friends, including Christine Sun Kim, had to kind of advocate for that through to Zoom, like just the company Zoom, to say, why isn't this accessible for us yet? So
you just touched on something, and there's a question from in the chat that's it's more of a general question, but we're wondering if you could talk a little bit about the differences, if you see any, between access and inclusion.
I don't know if there are any differences. Um, I think to be accessible is to be inclusive, although, you know, some people may not relate to access in the same way and think that access means the same thing for everybody. People might have different definitions of access according to what minority group you're from. And even though these days we're talking more about intersectionality and the importance of that, I still think that there is a lot of silos that happen across minority groups, so that, you know, we're still kind of somewhat separated. It's really interesting because sometimes, you know, I've seen really important texts and really important exhibitions emerge over the last 10 years, and for some reason they're still leaving out the disabled community. So even though they might be talking about the importance of feminist art or the importance of race in art or queer art, it's like, well, where is the disabled component? I don't understand why that's been left out of the conversation. So I think you can be accessible in a museum, i.e. wheelchair ramps, but you're not necessarily being inclusive of every person in that, you know, conversation. I don't know if that's making sense to everybody. So yeah, I mean, just the other day I was online and I was actually calling out a fairly prominent curator who was using language around disability in a way that was really problematic. She was using the word blind in a pejorative sense, like, oh, you're blind to the image, or you're being blind to the issue, which is a really actually common phrase that people use, like a blind spot. But that language is actually really offensive to the blind community. Because why should our embodiment of blindness be seen in a pejorative way? Why is it a negative condition? Why can't it be a generative positive condition? So just to get changing that, you know, that phrase. Joseph Grigley is the person who's responsible for thinking around, you know, language and how, you know, offensive it can be. And other minority groups understand that. But for some reason, I feel like society at large is still lagging behind more inclusive language around disabled folks. I hope I've answered the question somewhat decently.
I think you did. One of the things that I noticed too in your presentation was that you were sharing a lot of examples that seemed to be from like UK or Canada and other places beyond the United States. Do you feel like in some ways that our institutions are behind? Because I mean, there's other institutions that are doing really interesting work, or yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do. In answer to your question, definitely. I do think that US institutions are behind. And yeah, I mean, there's probably a very few organizations here. Like I know there's one, I can actually put it into the chat if you think that it would go to people, but it's called Disart. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's based in Grand Rapids in Michigan. And they are an organization that's dedicated to setting up a festival and a exhibition every couple of years on disability art. That's probably the only one that I'm aware of in the whole of the US. I mean, there's Body of Work as well. They're also in Chicago. Bodies of Work rather. So I'll type that one into the chat. But other than that, there's not very many other spaces. And I think that's also attributed to, we also, even within our universities, there's disability studies departments, but there isn't any kind of departments that are kind of where the intersection of disability and art come together. So, and just general, like there's very few textbooks on the subject matter. It's still considered an emerging field. It's only now that disability art is becoming trendy, so to speak. I don't know if anyone's heard about, there's a big crypt art. It's called Crypt Time. And it's at the Museum of Modern Kunst in Frankfurt in Germany, a big show that has just opened with many young disabled artists in the show from the US and in Canada and the UK. But also they're intermixing that work with some deceased artists like Felix Gonzalez Torres. And so it seems like a really promising, interesting show. But the critique would be, I wonder if they're thinking about access. Like how fully are they thinking? Like it, so you have disability as your thematic and the artists themselves are working with access as a thematic, but is the show itself actually thinking about access for their disabled audiences? And so that's something that I have to still interrogate, I guess, with, I might try and email the curator and ask them if they're thinking about those ideas.
I think that, in terms of your research, I mean, like I said in the beginning, I mean, I met you in 2016, and I also heard you speak at Common Field in 2017 when you did a panel on curatorial activism. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the in terms of the idea of this curatorial activism and like what you're hoping your long-term goals you want to achieve in the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I might like marry your question with the one that I see in the chat because it's talking about my upcoming publication.
Yes, that was my other question.
Yeah, so my talk today is the title of my new book, which is going to be released at the end of 2022, so next year. And I'm trying, I think by having the publication out there about actually curating access is also, I mean, there's over 30 contributors to the book from around the world. So I'm trying to demonstrate to people like, there's stuff that's happening that we have a template for how we might do it by looking at other artists and curators, art historians, how they're actually trying to wrestle with this idea of access in a more of a creative way in their work. And Shannon Finnegan, by the way, I should mention, is works with another wonderful person called Bajana Cochliat, and they have this organization or workshop rather called Alt Text as Poetry. So they literally have workshops with people teaching them how to do alt text and calling it a poetic exercise, which is along what I've encouraged my artists to do too as part of my exhibition making. So like this kind of objective, or you're talking about long-term objectives. And I think just by doing more publishing, and like the talks are really great too, obviously, but by having that publication out there and showing to the community that, hey, there's like lots of people that are doing this and here's how you can do it, I'm hoping that it will become more of a permanent fixture in people's minds in the museum world, that they will start trying to implement these ideas more actively and more consistently.
Yeah. Is your book going to be able to be read through auto reader? Because I find like one of the things that I struggled with, especially when I moved back to Houston, because it's very much a car culture, but was trying to find books that were referencing the art world that were audio books. Like there's not a lot of them that are out there.
Right. I'm not sure, to be honest. I'll have to talk to, it's being published through Routledge, so I'll have to talk to them about their plans for that. But I know that it's going to be released first as a hard copy book, and then as a soft cover, and then it will be released also as an ebook. So the ebook should have all those multiple formats available, and also can be adjusted on, screen reader friendly, etc. So that will be good. And actually, literally, as I'm talking about alt text, I'm actually working with all my authors right now. They're delivering alt text to me for all of the images that are going to be embedded in the chapters. And alt text, they have particular requirements for the alt text. They said that it can be no longer than 100 words. And I think that's kind of a shame, because I could write a whole page on, alt text for an image. But we have to unfortunately abide by, word limitations and all of that inside of a published book. Yeah, somebody said 100 words is nothing. Yeah, I agree. So, and then I see a comment here. It says from YouTube watcher Dennis. I am familiar with Taranay's, kind of familiar with Taranay's work, but is there a chance that I can learn a little bit more from Dennis about what Taranay is doing?
If you can't come through the chat or send it, I can definitely, oh, he's typing in the YouTube, I see that. Dennis is also a curator who works down in Galveston Art Center, and I'm happy to put you in conversation.
Great.
Amazing individual.
Great. And Taranay is also published there's a disability and art history book that came out, I think it was last year or the year before. I'm published in it too, but she's also written she's also one of the chapter contributors to that book. So, but I've never met her, but she's doing really good work too as a disabled curator. Are there any more comments or questions?
It doesn't look like anything's coming in, but I'll give it a few more minutes.
Sure.
I appreciate you coming and speaking to us as our Diverse Discourse guest lecturer.
Sure.
Like I said, I've been following your work for a while, and to be able to be in conversation again with you is amazing. And hopefully we can have you come to Houston come to Houston. Sorry, I was reading the chat. Have you come to Houston sometime in the future? And I know that you've done workshop series and things.
Yeah.
Like that, and so it would be great. It doesn't look like right now there's any chat or conversations, so I guess go ahead and call it a night.
Sure. I also added, I just want to say, I added here, there's another new show that's opening up in Chicago called Crip, and that's curated by a really wonderful deaf artist named Liza Silvestre, and she is I would just Google that if you wanted to learn more about that. It's another great show. So there's more and more excellent shows that are being curated on disability art and thinking about creative access too. So I'd encourage folks to look into that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all these recommendations. So
sure.
This is our webinar tonight has been recorded, and it also has been streamed on our YouTube. We're going to clean it up a little bit, and then we'll have it with a transcription and audio captions on it later, probably Friday or Monday. But if anybody has any questions or would like to follow up, you can visit Amanda's website, or you can email me at DiverseWorks, ashley@diverseworks.org. I'm happy to answer any questions or put you in touch with Amanda. And tomorrow, Amanda is going to be doing our virtual studio visit. So she's going to be meeting with a couple of artists via Zoom to learn a little bit about their work, as well as sharing a little bit more about her work that she's doing. So thank you, Amanda, so much. Thank you to our ASL interpreters tonight who joined us and did a wonderful job. And thank you for our DiverseWorks staff as well.
Thank you.